In this video, I'm going to show you a couple of things that drive me nuts in Blender that I consider to be really egregious workflow problems that I think really need to be resolved. And they revolve in part around the way Blender handles assets and materials. I've been working on a project where what I consider glitches have just been driving me nuts, and I figured I would pass this over to the community and show how I've partially solved this and hope some developer sees this and can either fix the problems or come up with workaround solutions. So I've created this very simple file to help illustrate the problem. So I've got the asset browser open and I've created a file containing a couple of objects and materials that I'm using in a project. So just imagine that you have a central file that you're working on and you've got auxiliary files of objects and materials that are being linked into the main file. And inevitably, you're going to need to access these source files to make a change to a material, for instance, or a geometric change to the objects that are being linked into the scene. So what Blender does is it sort of blocks us in a couple of important places along this path to making edits and changes in this collaborative environment between a main file and auxiliary files. So let's come over to the asset browser and let's drag one of our materials. Let's take this blue and we're going to drag it onto the object. Now you're going to note that I have it set in linked mode. You can do it in append mode where it duplicates the material, brings it into the new file, and breaks the link to the source. But from the workflow standpoint for what I'm wanting in the project, we want a link established because I have multiple files that are going to be referencing this master set of materials for the entire project, and I don't want duplicates. So we've applied this in link mode. And we come over and we realize that we need to make a change to the material. And when we look at it, it is grayed out because it's linked. And so this is the first glitch that drives me nuts, is that Blender doesn't give you a way over here of editing the material in the linked file. But worse than that, it doesn't even give you a way of accessing the source file. It just blocks it. Let's come over and look at this in the shader editor. And we can see that here too. Everything is grayed out because it's an externally linked file and it says you can't edit this. This drives me nuts because here they don't even give you a way of pulling up the original file that contains the material, which is in a directory of assets that I've created for this project. Okay, sure, I could come over here and I could either go to the file browser and I could go hunting through and I could find the project, right? Or, because I don't want to go constantly changing out the window mode up here, I want a way to gain access to that original file. So what Blender does is it says the only way you can do that is by coming back to the asset browser, hunting through what could be a very, very long and large and complex list of materials and assets to get to the one that you want. In this particular case, it's called blue. So, okay, so I would, if I couldn't find it, then I could type in blue and I could find it. This brings me to the next thing that drives me nuts. The way Blender functions with regard to materials is that you can't edit a material unless it's assigned to the object. In other 3D applications that I've used that contain repositories of materials for a file or a project, if you see an icon, you can edit the material from that icon without having to attach it to an object or select an object that it's attached to. And that's a real savings. I'm going to show you in a minute a scenario where that would be highly, highly useful. So we're blocked from editing it here in the file that the material is linked into. Blender is not even going to try and help me find or edit that directly here from the material. I have to go hunt it down in the asset browser. Then once we've found it, we open the blend file that it lives in. And then here in the asset browser for this source asset project material, as I've got it called up here, you then once again a second time, have to go searching for the material. It happens to be at the beginning of my list here, but in a complex project, you could have a great many materials that you've got to hunt through to find it. Then you've got to select it again, and you've got to drag it to an object, and then you can come over and make a change. So let's say I come over here and I've changed this blue. I need the nature of that blue to change. So then you come over and you save it here in this duplicate that's editing the source material file, asset file, and you quit and you come back to the main file, and nothing has changed. So this brings me to another issue that I have with currently how Blender is functioning. When you've made that source change, Blender does nothing to help you actually import those changes into the file. So what you have to do is you actually have to come over to the outliner and switch its mode over to blend file. And in a very complex project setup where you've got a lot of things going on, this is going to be very tedious. You've got to come down and hunt and find what that asset linked file is, and you have to manually reload it in order to get those changes to show up. Then you click again to come back to your view layer that you're working with. And then you notice that the asset itself is still the old preview image. So that makes you think in your mind, well, gosh, has that changed? So what you have to do is, once again, you've got to come back over to the original blend file. And once you've made a change, you need to manually select any of the materials that you've made, and you have to manually refresh the icon for it. It doesn't do that for you. And that brings me to my next criticism. Why doesn't it automatically just update a material icon preview after you've made an edit? Why wouldn't it just do that for you? If I went through and made a whole bunch of changes for all of these materials, I would need to, well, one, I would need to assign it to an object, right? And then I have to come over here and click that, and then I have to do the next one, assign it there, and then come over and make some change to that, and then click the refresh button again. And that just gets tedious. You know, in complex workflows where you have a great many clicks, the more clicks that we're having to manage just for stuff that could be automated is really a pain. So then we come back over, we save, we come back to our source file, and then we have to once again come back over to the blend file and manually tell it to reload and update. In my mind, these are real workflow gotchas. When you're in the middle of an actual real complex project and you're having to jump through all of these little hoops and inefficiencies that Blender's native user interface is introducing, it really just grinds on you after a while. So as far as the material goes, let me reiterate. Let's come back over to the shading editor. What Blender needs to do for the user is give us a context menu right here. I can right click on that says open source file. So I can jump from this location and immediately edit this in the source file. So that's one thing. Or over here, have a button that says edit source file for this linked material. Something like that. I ultimately want to be able to click asset icons and be able to edit the material here. So let me just show you another situation where having to select the object in order to edit the material is a painful thing. So here's a situation that Blender sort of forces its users into having to jump through some hoops on. So I've got this car here, and this is a collection instance. And I've got this as a collection instance because I've got a source collection of all the parts and pieces of the model that I want to be in a default position and orientation that I don't want to change. I want to be able to come here to the collection instance and rotate and do transformations here without, messing up the default status of its source files. Well, let's say you're coming in and you're needing to make a change to the material for this car. Well, Blender doesn't give you access to being able to change the material because we can't access the individual components of the car. If I had a repository of materials in Blender that I could simply click the icon and then make the change of the material, then I could preview changes that I'm making here without having to actually select the object, and that would propagate to the collection instance of my main scene. So one of the workarounds that I've done in this case, one of the hoops that Blender is making me do, is I create an object in the scene that isn't renderable, but it gives me access to being able to find the material itself, and then I can make a change to the material and have that propagate to the collection instance. But again, this is just, to me, just a little bit of a clunky workaround. Why not have a repository of all the materials? Or better yet, give me some sort of like eyedropper where I can click on the object and have that material become editable here so I can make a change in my main scene. To me, these are just indications of Blender's rigid way of editing materials only by selecting an object that contains the material. So let's jump back over to this scene here, and let's take a look at objects. We've been looking at materials. Let's return the outliner back over to the view layer mechanism. Now, let's say that we have a couple of objects right here that we want to bring into our scene. We want them linked because they're going to be used in multiple files and they need to be a single source file for all of those. We drag that in. In this particular case, it's linked a collection instance into the scene. In fact, it dropped here into cameras. So let me move that back into the main scene. What if we want to make a change to the source file here? So here again, this is another one of those situations where natively, without any add-ons or anything, Blender just sort of stops you in your tracks from an easy way of gaining access to the source data for this collection instance referenced to my external assets file. But it turns out the Blender actually does have built-in functionality that will facilitate this linkage. It's just not enabled by default. Come under Preferences and then Add-ons or Extensions. It may be that you're going to have to search for it in Extensions if it's not installed. I have it installed, but we need to enable it. So we're going to type in Edit, and there's the Edit Linked Library. I've talked about this before in another video, and it's very, very useful if you're doing this externally linking to resources. I would highly recommend that you enable this. And what will happen is now that that's there, press the N key, you're going to see that we have a new entry down here called Edit Linked Library. In fact, I'm going to bring it to the top to make it really visible. I have a collection instance, and Blender now detects, this add-on detects that it's externally linked. And so we can come over here and just click this, and it will immediately jump us into this file. So I can come in now and I can make a change to return this back to sort of its original position. But once you're done with that, all you need to do is come down and click Return to File, and it jumps you back to the main file. So they've built in functionality for this, and it's just not turned on by default. And it's really, really useful when you're using externally linked files. But what if you happen to be using a situation where you're not using link, but you're using append or append reuse data? Append means it's going to bring in and put a collection instance here that's all unique to itself. And if you put append reuse data, it means if you pull in multiple of these into the scene, they're all going to be linked back to an internal collection to this file. So they all have use cases for them. So I've jumped back to my default scene right here, and I've removed those two collection instances. And we're going to come back and we're going to drag it back in using just append mode, which again is just going to duplicate the data into the new scene and break the link back to the source asset file. But now when you come over and you take a look at it, all we see in our outliner is a single collection instance. But there's nowhere in sight where the source is for us. And so what you have to do is you have to do a whole bunch of head scratching trying to figure out, how do I make an edit to this? Because this is a reference back to some source data. Blender is trying to be very clever, and it's hiding that from us. So unless you know this trick that I'm about to show you, you will be completely mystified as to how to make any edit changes to this collection instance. So what we have to do is we have to come over back to the outliner, come down to Blend File, and then you just come down to where it says Collection here, expand Collection, and there it is. So it's in the Blender file, it's just not in the view layer that we happen to want to be using. So you have to right click on this, and then you have to come down and say Link to Scene. And then when you come back to the main view layer, now it is in the main scene. And that's fine, you can turn it off, but now you have access to the original data file, and you simply would have to know that you have to jump in and gain access to it in the main file over here, and then relink it back into the scene so you can actually gain access to being able to edit it. So I'm going to show you another add-on that will make this much more usable. So what I'm going to do is return this back to its previous state where I come back over to this 4 cubes collection. I'm going to right link on it and I'm going to come down and I'm going to do unlink. And that will remove it from this view layer. We still have it in the file down here in Blender file. We'll still have access to it here. So let's come back over. Let's come back to our view layer and let's install and use another add-on. So I'm simply going to come over here to add-ons and we're going to type in edit again. And this one is called Edit Instanced Collection. Now this is one that was developed by somebody and then it's been updated a couple of times and it's super, super useful. Let's go ahead and edit it. Now this one you're going to need to download and I'm going to give you a link to it so you can download it. But I use this all the freaking time. It is so useful. We'll go ahead and enable that. And here's what it does is I click on this collection instance, press the N key. Right over here, we have Edit Instanced Collections. Now, it may be at the bottom. Its default is to be down here at the bottom, so you may have to scroll. But we come over and say Edit Collection, and it drops this. It'll give you kind of a little instruction. This isn't an error message. It just gives you some instruction here. But it gives us direct access to the source collection file isolated from everything else so that we can come in and we can make a change to this. And then you just do a return to scene. And now that is propagated. And you'll notice that we didn't even have to bring that collection back here into the main scene. It simply found it in the blend file. Now, the great thing is, if we came over here and we still went to blend file and we manually came back over here and said link to scene, so it brings it back into the main view layer that we're working with. So I'm going to turn it off. And this is what it's super useful for, is it still functions exactly the same when the collection source is in the main view layer, but it's turned off. You just come over here and you do Edit Instance Collection, Edit, and there it gives us access to it again. And we can make the change that we want. And then we return to the scene and that change has been made. So this is supremely useful when you're doing lots of collection instances and you want to gain access to make a change to that source. So these two editing add-ons fill in some of the gaps in Blender's native functionality. And I find these super indispensable. Like I would go crazy if I didn't have these. The next add-on that I'm going to talk about that solves what I consider to be sort of workflow related happens to do with each of these environments having their own view. In every environment that you come to work in, by default, Blender allows them to have their own independent view. The way the view camera is positioned, the objects that are in the view, everything about that is unique to each one of these working environments. On paper, that sounds pretty good, but in practice, that actually gets to be very stressful. Let me give you an example. So let's come over to layout right here, and suddenly you find yourself with layout having a very different view, and you have to kind of stop and reorient yourself as to what you were just working on, which is the blue cube. So, okay, so there's the blue cube. I can come down here and I can gain access to that by zooming in again. But you come over to modeling and it has its own view. And here again, I've got to go rotating around and figuring out where that cube is. And then you come over to UV edit. Well, UV edit has its own environment, and then you come over to shading, and we're back to what it is that we want to have. Let's say we come over to animation, and animation has its own completely different view setup. There is an add-on that you can download. It's part of the repositories. It's basically part of Blender, but now you have to install it from the repository. It's called Synchronize Workspace. Go ahead and enable it. And then you're going to see right up over here, there's this new little icon, toggle synchronization. You can turn it off at any time that you don't want it. And you can also turn it on and off per tab, right? So if you don't want this, if you want one of your tabs to still have an independent working layout and view, you can do that. But now when I come over from animation to shading to UV editing, to modeling and layout, The cube remains the same. The viewport itself obviously has different aspect ratio, so that's going to change a little bit. But as I'm moving between my environments, it's keeping synchronization. And to me, that just works so much better, and it solves the stress of coming to a different environment, having to go hunt and find that every time you switch to a different view. And like I said, you can very easily tell it, let's say for animation, I want that one to be unique. Then I could come over to animation and it would still retain its own independence. So when I switch here back to animation, that one has its own independence, but I like that because I'm controlling it. So anyway, this video is all about trying to solve some of the native workflow issues that I think Blender has, and hopefully bring the attention to some of the developers so they can patch some of these, what I consider workflow irritants at best.